I just finished reading an article online, and it talks about this transgender teenager who ended his life in a correctional facility. And the way the article was written just really bothered me, because it's written in the context of, had the teenager had mental health help, then perhaps this wouldn't have happened. And that may or may not be true, but the article talked about all the labels that this poor teenager inherited, like schizophrenia symptoms, borderline personality disorder, trauma, gender identity issues, and just putting all these labels on this poor person who's no longer here. And then at the end of the article it says, if you're transgender or gender non-conforming and considering suicide, call this number. And I'm thinking, gender non-conforming? What does that even mean? Like, that is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Like, as if somebody wants to call a hotline after reading that. Oh, I'm a non-conforming person. It's just ridiculous. And then the article talks about how this teenager was just granted clinical help, and then a few hours later was found not living. And I don't think they yet were able to intervene with the clinical help. But it acts like, oh, had they just had clinical help, everything would have been fine. And that is far from the truth. I feel like if this poor person got wind that they were going to have extra help, that might have given them more impetus to say, I don't want that help. And this person was in there for lighting their house on fire, setting fire to their house. That kind of shows, like, the person's like, F you, like, get away from me, parents. And then the parents are trying to come at this poor teenager with all this psychological clinical intervention. The person's like, peace out, I'm out of this world. It's just such a sad story, because it's contorted in such a way that it's like, oh, well, we need more clinical help for these people. When it's not true. We need more love and more understanding and more empathy and more compassion in daily life, not more clinical interventions once somebody's at their wit's end. Like, how did that even get to that point? It's just so sad and terrifying, because what people think is help for people is not really that helpful. It can be a good temporary band-aid, but it doesn't fix anybody's problems. I guess I'm just feeling a little bit grr about it, because I have to make a choice between staying here and working and maybe leaving the country for a bit to explore a different opportunity. And I don't know. Right now I'm on the path of the job, but I don't even know if I feel comfortable working in the job. And maybe I do more so on some days than others. It's really difficult, because I don't know if peer support really fits that well within the mental health system. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, as it's said. It just doesn't really fit. And so am I setting people up for disaster, for failure? Because I know for myself, working in peer support was kind of a failure and a disaster for me. And I love supporting people, but it's so difficult to support it within a context of something's wrong with the people, and not something's wrong with the greater whole of things. And why do people get to that point? And what I shared about that talk I went to, where they said, well, how do you deal with so much child abuse and societal inequalities? Well, you just medicate the people that aren't able to get through it, because it's sort of designed so it happens to a large portion of people. And I don't know if I want to work in terms of the reaction to something that happens so far down the line, and it's putting the blame on the person. Like, to put the blame on a person and say, oh, they are mentally ill, is psychological scapegoating. So I'm just having trouble with that today, and maybe other things in general. And this morning I woke up and I felt like, oh, maybe I'm sort of done making videos. I don't know if anything else is going to really come through me. And then I was editing my last 2 videos and I wrote a bunch more stuff that made sense at the time. So maybe it would be nice if I would be able to get to what I wrote quicker, because if I can, then it'll be more fresh in my brain in terms of what I was thinking. Because the last videos I did, I only really read out or talked about half of what I wrote down. It's maybe because it just wasn't really resonating at the moment. And these videos, again, are not about, oh, there's one way of seeing it alternative to the medical paradigm. It's that there's a million other ways to think about it and see it. And we can be creative and we can think about it in different ways, and we can use our brains to think about it instead of just buying into the stigma story. And that's the thing, once a person gets a label, they acquire the allostatic load of the stigma and then are said to need to recover from the label more so, and the allostatic load of the label more so than the actual distress, which may or may not be mental illness. And I wrote down a note again about how it's not just about learning to control ourselves in different states of consciousness, it's also about changing our behaviors in more balanced states of consciousness, if you want to say that, in order to create more neural pathways. So when that extra energy comes in, we have more degrees of freedom through which we can choose to express that energy in all those different states. And part of that is also making relational pathways, so not just behaving by oneself in a vacuum, but ways of relating, and that is a relational pathway, and it's to do with the mirror neurons as well. So extra energy wants to be made relational. And I think part of it is to do with this urge to create new language, and some of it is relational language, not just language of the ego and me and my own desires and personal goals, but relating and what can we build together. And I think our ego structure is implied in the way we use language, and that could be one of the ways that language is actually turned against us. It's turned inward and circular in our prefrontal cortex, and it's not allowed to just channel through us. There needs to be a world-centric language, a language knowing that we're all the same and it's all one organism, like ants. Imagine if all the ants started acting on their own. We're being thanked by our own voice. We're not actually thinking. And we feel we have the freedom of choice because we can choose one sentence in our brain, in our own voice, over another. And we just pick between those 2 sentences. But both are sentencing us to a life of limitation based on our own past thoughts in our own voice. And the thing with this world-centric consciousness and perception, this trans consciousness, we start to feel ourselves differently. We start to experience feelings and emotions and sensations that our ego self, our linear thought pattern, would block off. And that linear thought pattern is our own voice, is sound, and there are other vibrations that we would sense and feel if we weren't blocked by the sound of our own voice. And the ego is actually 741 hertz, which is dissonant with the frequency of love. And we would actually be in contact with that frequency, and that frequency would feed us different sounds and images on our mind screen, which would actually be congruent with the field of love that nature and the universe is. And the sound of our voice is what actually moves us out of alignment with the field of gravity. So working on one's posture is one way to quiet one's own voice and one's own head slightly. And I wonder, because they talk about how our intentions and our language changes our DNA or changes the structure of the water in our body. Well, I wonder if we have world-centric intentions, because it's one thing to just change one's thoughts from bad about oneself to good about oneself. But what about if one isn't thinking about oneself at all? What if one is thinking about the greater humanity? I feel the sound of our own voice, our ego, this discordant frequency pulls us out of alignment with the universal mind, which we have access to at any moment. It doesn't take time. There's no such thing as personal development to make the ego better and better and better. That is just a thought. That is just a sound in our mind. It's not actuality. Actuality is when the mind is silent, and then we're actually in the field of love, which is 528 hertz, with no discordant ego happening, and that only takes snap of a finger. So personal growth is false. It's actually just something that happens in a moment. And when a person is in the field of love and congruent with that, one flowers. One doesn't need to think about personal growth. It's a flowering of consciousness, because we are also that love. And they talked about in that Len Horowitz interview that a blade of grass vibrates at 528 hertz, which is the frequency of love. Well, I feel we also vibrate at 528 hertz, and I think that's actually our adjacent light body vibration. But when we're having our own ego thoughts in our own head, it pulls us out of alignment with that, and we're not anymore vibrating at 528 hertz, because we have this voice in our head going blah blah blah, and that sound is permeating our entire being. It's not just happening in our head, it's changing every single cell in our body and pulling us into the field of gravity. And when we're pulled into the field of gravity like that, when we're out of alignment, we feel ourselves more, and when we feel ourselves more, we feel ourselves as separate. When we're in alignment, we feel ourselves and we arise as the relationship, as the oneness, that we're all in that field of love of 528 hertz. And our own voice in our own head is constantly bringing up old memories, and we do that in order to avoid pain. So if we have a painful thought and we bring up a pleasurable memory, then we feel pleasure, and then this just keeps going and going, and we're living in our own memories. And that would be like using our smartphone just to look at old pictures and never doing anything else with it, and looking at all the time and not looking around at what's going on outside, which is kind of how it's getting, but it's sort of like that. I feel 528 hertz is hypofrontality. So Stephen Kotler talks about transient hypofrontality, which happens in flow. Well, I feel that we can be in hypofrontality all the time. It doesn't have to be transient. It's just when the mind isn't chattering. And when it's not chattering, we're in the field of love, which is 528 hertz, which is all of nature and Gaia. And we're part of Gaia. And if we were in the field of love, we would be cooperating and collaborating with the energy of Gaia. And so I think that to think we need this cognition going on all the time, that's actually what is making us feel separate. And when we don't have that happening, we feel oneness. So to need to train to be some kind of extreme athlete, in order to do that, it actually takes no time at all. And Len Horowitz talked about agrosonics, which is using sound to make plants grow more. Well, I think there's actually Gaia sonics, which is just the frequency of love in theirs, that sonic energy all around us. 528 hertz is the C note, it's an actual sound. So when we're not hearing the sound of our own voice, which is interfering with the sound of 528 hertz, we are sensing that 528 hertz with our heart, and that feeds different sounds into our brain, which are barely perceptible. It more feels like intuition, and that could be partly what intuition is. We sort of hear this and see this and sense this thing, and it's very, very quiet sound. Like, it's like, how do I know that? I didn't think that myself, but it's this impression, this pattern, this holistic perception that comes up, and that's more how we can actually perceive all the time if our minds aren't chattering. I'm not saying anything new. This is all that Eckhart Tolle is talking about all the time, is a silent mind. And I would actually like to thank him for my silent mind, because it was his process that allowed my mind to become silent. And so our brain, our ego, operates on pleasure, pain, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So we use happy images if we're in pain, and the painful images come back, so then we use the pleasurable images again. But we're actually using these images in our mind, these illusions, as self-medication. And what happens is an image goes into the mind that's pleasurable, and we actually receive a hit of dopamine, for example. And then a painful image comes in, and we try to either bring in a pleasurable image, which gives us the dopamine again, or we say go and eat a cookie or go and watch TV. So all these things that give us dopamine. Before I talk about that, I realized I've talked before about how the voice in our head scrambles the flow energy that we would otherwise have access to. So that prefrontal cortex stuff is mostly just noise, and it's scrambling the energy, and that makes sense in terms of the sound. So if the sound is coming in and hitting the heart, because there's a heart brain, and that information, there's 7 times as many neural pathways up to the brain, so it's supposed to be actually sending information to the brain from the heart. And I think that's partly blocked because we're playing images on our mind screen, which is actually interfering and blurring our actual vision of the outside. If we're not actually looking outside fully, if we have all these interference patterns of images in the way, then there's no way that that sound energy that hits the heart, the 528 hertz, can actually be seen, because it's not seen with our perception, with our eyes. So the image is interfering, and the sound is interfering with the sound of the 528 hertz as well. 528 hertz is probably the sound of silence. And that's what I was talking about before, with how the prefrontal cortex actually wastes energy. If the sound energy is coming in, the sound in our mind, which is discordant, is wasting the energy that we always have access to every moment. It's not about producing better voices in our head in order to get to that. It's about silence. And it's obviously about silence in a way, because that's what flow researchers are researching. They're researching how people that get to extreme athlete status are able to shut their mind up, because they basically have to in order to be that elite. And one of the reasons why they like doing it is because it makes them have a silent mind, and it makes them feel free. But we don't have to be extreme adventure athletes in order to do that. It's accessible to us right this moment, not 5 steps or 10 steps or 12 steps, right now. And that's the only time we can ever access it, is now, because if we're thinking, we're not in the now. And also, I think I said last video how Len Horowitz said that water is a superconductor of light and sound. So if you think of the light and sound energy around us, and the sound energy of 528 hertz, it comes into our apparatus, and if we're perceiving it, that's going to change the structure of water in our bodies, and that's going to change our posture and our strength and our alignment, and it's also going to change how we transmit the sound. So right now we're just transmitting the sound of our ego voice, and it's messing up the structure of our water, and it's just keeping us stuck in that limited space with our own self. But if we are decoupled from that, and if it's quiet, then all of a sudden our whole structure shifts immediately, because the structure of water shifts immediately, and the sound is of 528 hertz is able to be channeled through us. But as soon as we start chattering on, it's over. We shift back. And that's why in moments of awe, when we're awestruck and we're not thinking, we lose perception of ourselves. We are almost everything in that moment. But then it switches back and we're just in our thinking mind again. I drew a little drawing again. So this is the 528 hertz coming up to the brain. And then there's this, I think it's 741, I can't remember, in the prefrontal cortex, which is like scrambling. It's like shh. And this pretty much is our ego self, which represents society. So it's sort of a mirror of that. And this represents knowing, like I am this, she is this, which is the judge. And we actually need a space of not knowing and wondering and being open and curious in order to suspend this. That's how we are as children. And I wrote down a variation of the quote, I think, therefore I am. I wrote, I think, therefore I think I know, which is actually pretty dangerous because we're limited by what we think we know. And we can't really see anything outside of that. And the 744 hertz or the 741, I can't remember, is the ego thinking. And it thinks, therefore it thinks it's separate. It thinks it's an ego. It could even be said, I think, therefore I am lonely. And I, again, think that if we can see with our hearts, we don't need science, because seeing with our hearts is actually seeing holistically, and it paints a picture on our mind screen of sounds and images that make things really obvious. Our strongest perceptual apparatus is clear eyes and a clear heart. And when the ego is scrambled or quiet, then the heart mind can give the proper information to the brain, as the brain hasn't been hijacked by ego thinking process of one's own voice and one's own head. It's amazing how we've been imprisoned by our own voice. I also feel that if the brain's not getting proper information from the heart mind, then the brain is going to decay. It decays by the limited structure of society. And the ego actually blocks the endomimetics. So I talked before about endomimetics, and that's the memes, the ideas and thoughts and insights that come out of nowhere, kind of like eureka or serendipity. We can have a lot of these if we're perceiving reality without self-abstraction and conceptualization about past memories that aren't part of the present moment. If we're carrying the past into the present, we can't meet the present and see the present for what it is. But when we can, that's the sound of 528 hertz. I believe that when it hits the heart and when we're seeing with our eyes through the 528 hertz, not the images that are produced by the 744 or 741 hertz. Those produce images that get in the way. When we're silent, we're in 528 mode, and then that hits our heart and produces the endomimetics, the new memes and the new perceptions that we can see and wonder about. And that's part of the inner science. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Like today I saw 2 daddy long leg spiders in my place, and they were both doing this weird thing where they're like on the wall, like really squashed to the wall in like a mini web by themselves. And I saw them there like that 2 days ago, and then I looked today and I thought, oh, I think they're waiting to see if it's safe to actually make their full little web, because I recently vacuumed and probably got their webs. They seemed to like know I was going to vacuum because they all moved. So their webs are gone. So it almost looks like they're just kind of waiting and biding their time to be like, where should I make my web, la-di-da. And I don't know if that's true, but it was much more interesting than, 10 years ago, blah, 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 blah. So it's just one of those things that I could think that and say, I'm going to spend the next 10 years doing scientific experiments to prove that. Or I could just rely on my own inner wisdom to think, well, that may or may not be true. I don't know. Interesting insight. But by having that clear perception, I was able to have that insight. And it doesn't really matter if it's true. It's just interesting. And it's creative. It's something different. It's something new. And if we were able to see reality in those ways all the time, with so many different things that we see, there'd be less need for TV. And I'm not thinking that a spider on the wall is more interesting than TV, but it can be. I feel like when we're in that field of 528 hertz and we're one with it, we have access to that information because we are one with it. It's the same vibration. Whatever it is at that vibration, we can perceive at that level. And speaking of Dr. David Hawkins, I haven't really talked that much about his work because I haven't been reading it recently, but I have in the past, and he talks about muscle testing. And it's interesting, since my last hospitalization, I always test strong for everything, so it no longer works for me. And I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign, but I used to be able to do, like, push my own arm and say my name and then say a different name, and then it would be weak. But now it's just strong no matter what I ask. And you'd have to look up applied kinesiology and muscle testing to know what I'm talking about. But I just find it strange that I see it as now I'm in a field of strength, perhaps, so can't really use it anymore. Maybe just perceiving itself is the same thing as that. Like the feeling of strength or weakness inside based on what I am perceiving. In a way, like the article I read today, that made me feel awful and weak. Not intellectually, but actually. I feel too like being out of alignment with gravity due to the ego thinking process and other things, but one of them is the ego thinking process is one of the things that causes the epigenetic changes. Like actually being out of alignment with gravity is going to change our genetics ever so slightly. So that would perhaps create a selective pressure to perhaps create more of a certain protein that holds our muscles to our bones stronger. So then now our muscles shorten because we need more tendon or ligament, for example. And I'm just making that up, but it would make sense that over time, even over time when we hunch forward, eventually our vertebrae, they actually fuse together in our neck to keep us up against the force of gravity. And if we are in proper alignment, that's not going to happen. Our vertebrae won't fuse together like that. So the field of gravity would be the one to cause the genetics to change in such a way for the bones to create more bone tissue to fuse it together. Now, what other epigenetic changes are created by being out of alignment with the field of gravity besides structural ones like that? And again, it's all the same thing. I'm seeing a lot of what I'm saying is circular because it's the ego thoughts, the sound, the discordant sound that pulls us out of alignment partially, as well as, say, physical injury. And then that pulling out of alignment causes epigenetic changes from the field of gravity, as well as epigenetic changes from the actual voice and the sounds, which is our intention and our thoughts, which changes the structure of water, which would also change our alignment in the field of gravity, as well as change the structure of water, so it's a different conductor of sound and light, as it's a liquid crystal semiconductor of sound and light. So it's going to not be able to receive the 528 hertz from the universe. And that's why I say there are special messages from the universe as 528 hertz, which we see that 528 hertz everywhere. But when we're thinking in 741 or 744, it's blocking us from seeing that because the images are in the way and its interference pattern in the way, and the prefrontal cortex is scrambling that energy. So there's an energetic thing going on, a sound thing going on, a light thing going on. And I think sound and light are related, and perhaps it is that they're related through water. Maybe that's the thing that the dolphins give the clue to with how they produce those underwater loops, and when they produce them out of their sonar device thing, it produces light. So they're able to produce light with making sound bubbles. So the way light and sound are related could be actually through water. And I remember saying in a different video, I think, that I had a different insight, that I think I'm more thirsty because I'm doing a lot of talking, and talking actually makes you lose water, and I'm doing hours of talking on these videos. But I'm seeing too that it could be that if my structure is shifting again, that I might need more water, and it could be however much the brain is made up of water too. When the water in the brain shifts, then it's more able to receive this 528 hertz as well. And I think there's still part of us that's always receiving the 528 hertz, and to me that's the adjacent light body. And the adjacent light body could just be the light, and then we're mostly water and minerals are frequencies of light, and then the sound. So we're made out of like sound, minerals, which are frequencies of light. So light, sound, and water. So that's kind of what we're made out of. And sound could be one of the underlying principles, but since we don't have silent minds, we're operating in a disordered fashion. So when we're in 528 hertz mode, which is kind of silence in a way, it's sound, but it would be a silent mind. We're in that map consciousness, which is more the dimension of light and sound of the human collective unconscious. So when we decouple from our own personal ego sound, we can go into the light sound dimension of the collective unconscious. And when we're perceiving and seeing and acting based on that, eventually it becomes too incongruent with this outer reality. Normally our compass is our ego voice at 741 or 744 hertz. I don't know which it is. And so when we drop into 528 hertz, we have a different compass. And that compass is beyond duality of good, bad, right, wrong. It's transpolar in a way. It's trans consciousness. It's trans duality. That experience is always richer. There's different feelings and thoughts, and it's not just me, yes, me, no, good, bad, whatever. It's a state based on sameness, which we're not usually used to operating based on sameness, how there's so much similarity, and it makes us gravitate towards everything because it feels so one. When we're not making these distinctions and judgments with our ego, we actually have a lot more energy, and when we do, it allows this other state to arise. We arise as the sameness in relationship. We don't arise as the judgment that differentiates and finds differences. And that could be part of how it gets scary, is we see that we're the same as the person who's judged as the worst of the worst, and we're the same as the highest of the highest, and everything in between. We can arise as anything given certain situation. Like if we look at somebody we feel that, and we feel that sameness because we know if we were living their life, we would be in their exact same shoes. We're just not living their life. We didn't have that path, but we can see how we could have, or we might have, or we might. And when we feel that sameness inside, we feel more responsible. We feel more able to respond because we can actually feel what it's like. And there's all these inner human dimensions that we have access to that are blocked by inner mentations, thoughts. And the inner mentations create inner time and space. And that inner time and space blocks all the million possible rich experiences of the inner human dimensions. And that's not even just the characteristics that we think of that I've mentioned, say play, laughter, love, connection, whatever. I'm seeing too that each moment is new, and there's no moment ever to be repeated. And if we're in those inner human dimensions of that multi-dimensionality, it's actually infinite. So we can experience our life in each moment as it unfolds, always in an entirely different way. And it just becomes more and more rich, not good, bad, right, wrong, yes, no, pleasure, pain. Those are very limited, and that's how we experience it, and we base it on the past images that we've recorded. And since we're recording and basing things on past images, we're experiencing things in a very, very, very limited way. Each moment is always new. I think that's part of the inner human dimensions. I never realized that until now, that it's always new. It's not just about, say, 8 dimensions or 20 dimensions, or I have an app, Universe of Emotions, with like 20,000 emotions. Those are 20,000 emotions, but there's probably zillions of actual ways to perceive in a way, because even with that example with the spider on the wall, that was just one thing. But if that happened each moment that I was perceiving and wondering and curious, it would always be something new if I was always looking at something different and wondering, and something came to my mind screen through the Endometrics by being connected to 528 hertz. It would always be new. It'd be like watching a new TV show every second of every day that was just completely new and fresh. And I think life is supposed to be that way. And in a way, people who say take LSD often experience themselves as like a distant star and a plant and an amoeba. Each one of those is a rich experience in its own and unique. So even we can experience that, and we are in a way, because everything is experiencing everything and we're connected to everything. So we could tune in to those other things, but we're tuned into our ego, so we don't tune into or ask or perceive those other things. And if we did long enough perceive and understand, we would understand what it is that we're here to be doing. If people could actually look at things and understand, we wouldn't harm other things. Because the things that are harmed, we would look at and feel that harm and feel ourselves as that, and we would be completely terrified. We need to be our embodied humanic selves, HU-manic, as in the colors, the spectrum of mania. Mania gives us access to the entire spectrum of human consciousness, and it's just a taste, because again, what arises each moment is always brand new. But we go back into our ego selves and go back to experiencing and re-experiencing our old conceptualizations, memories, and abstractions about ourselves. Oh, 50 minutes.